Alright, YouTube, some people in the last video that I made about the Anunnaki, etc., were asking me about Neanderthal DNA, and I told them that actually figured into the next video I'd be making, and I'm, of course, now making it now. And it's sort of the second part of the first video that I made, and it goes into very similar topics about these ancient races of people, these sort of unexplained megalithic structures, and things of that nature, the existence of space aliens or some sort of extraterrestrial race. It goes into all of that, and it goes into additional detail. And it figures in somewhat with what's called the Bok Saga. Now, I've made a video on this before. Most people probably haven't dug that far back in my video history. The Bok Saga, and you can look that up, B-O-C-K Saga, is a Finnish language system. It's a symbolic language system. It's partially based in mythology and partially based in linguistics, the linguistics of the Norse language that was present in that area. And it recounts a period of time that supposedly, and the Hindus ironically have something similar, which is why Lord Bok spent time in India, I'm presuming, about cultures that go back before the last ice age. The last ice age, of course, is many tens of thousands of years ago, and the idea is that there were cultures at the time that had civilization already. They had metal tools, they had, wooden implements, they were building with stone, they were doing things that later cultures were doing anyway. The story behind the Bok Saga is that these were taking place in northern Europe, around the Scandinavian region primarily, and of course the onset of glaciation during the Ice Age would have destroyed all evidence of any such cultures. This seems far-fetched until you realize two things. Number one, as I said, if there was a culture there when the glaciers scoured that area down into mountain ridges, it would have completely obliterated any form of culture that had been there. You wouldn't have found any recognizable remnants. All wood would have been pulverized, stone, any metal tools would have been completely decimated. It would have destroyed literally any remnants of that culture. Number two, there are a strange number of ancient cities. Of course, we now have technology that allows us to go over the ocean and map things with some degree of accuracy. There are a surprising number of ruins in what was during the middle of that Ice Age land and what is now covered in 10, 20, up to 100 feet of water. There are ruins there. There was one ruin off the coast of India, a double city ruin that would have been considerable in size. It had stone megalithic structures. It is there. It is a real place. It's already been mapped. They've already found metal tools and wooden implements from it. Of course, salt water is very good at preserving wood, which, fresh water or land wouldn't have been good at preserving. They found the artifacts. And this city lies under enough water so it couldn't have possibly not been submerged any earlier than 20,000 years ago, maybe more. And that's at the earliest dating. Archaeology and history, mainstream archaeology and history, don't have an explanation for this, because they insist that the earliest stone work that we see in the world was, number one, very small, and number two, wasn't that long ago. Even the existence of, and again, I pointed this out, Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years ago. And it shook up the archaeological world, and it was in National Geographic and Smithsonian and all of these things, because people weren't supposed to be making stone structures back then of that size. Any stone structures they were making were supposed to be very small, rudimentary shelters, maybe a storage pit for bones or something, some sort of ritual location, but it wasn't supposed to be anything advanced, certainly nothing that had any definite shape to it that was actually habitable for long periods of time. People in archaeology and history simply said that's not possible. Human civilization hadn't risen to a high enough level then for them to quarry stone to begin with, so how were they building these structures? It would have been just cobbled together if it existed at all. But this city off the coast of essentially what's the Goa area of India is presumably 20,000 years old. They can't explain. That was during the Ice Age. Technically, we're still in the Ice Age. We haven't reached the polar minimum yet. We're still technically in it. But I mean, long ago, back when a substantially larger area of land was extant on the surface of the Earth, the water level was substantially lower during that period of time because it was all ice. The Bach Saga tells, and some of the Vedic stories and the Hindu stories tell, that these cultures have actually been around for a much longer period of time than ruins and archaeology currently suggest. It's discounted in the mainstream because there's no evidence of it. The problem being, a lot of these cultures, if they were coastal, they would have been inundated by water. If they were anywhere in northern Europe, in the northern reaches of the world, they would have been crushed by glaciers and would have disappeared entirely, and there wouldn't even be a single carved stone left to tell that the culture was ever there. So these two stories fit in fairly well. The Vedic stories about these cities, and some of them were coastal cities, tens of thousands of years ago that disappeared over time, but people still remembered that they were there. It fits in with some of these ruins. There are some in the Caribbean, in what is called the Bermuda Triangle. There's some ruins there that are under 20, 30, 40 feet of water. They couldn't have possibly been habitable any more recently than about 10,000 years ago. And again, the Bach Saga tells the same story. It tells that people were living in the Scandinavian region before this last ice age. The saga recounting actually details the existence of the ice age itself, which if this is substantiated and they can show that this is an actual oral history and it's not just some recent creation by the Bach family, which doesn't seem to be the case. It does seem to be rooted in reality. There are ruins up there that have been excavated. They have actually found part of one of these ruins where they said it would be, the Lemminkainen Temple. The idea is that this culture flourished for some time, and then it started getting colder. Their culture was crushed under these glaciers, and they moved south. Now what's interesting is this. When the ice began to recede, you see all of these various megalithic structures start to go up all over the world. During the peak of that ice age, assuming that humanity was already civilized and had moved to that inner region and started building along the coasts, all their cities would have been along the coast. A large amount of this inland area, because there was so much less water going up into the atmosphere, would have been inhospitably dry. You can presume that that would be the case. Some of these island areas would have been fine. A lot of the mainland areas where, ironically, you don't see many ruins would have been too dry to even have. It would have been like the Sahara Desert, the Mojave or something. So they built logically on the coastlines because that's where the majority of the life was. And, of course, these cities are now covered in water. And they do exist. They're there. There's that one in Bermuda. I can't remember the exact name of it. They thought it was some sort of road. It's covered in paving stones. And for years, archaeologists said, well, that's not actually, this is a natural formation. It's not an actual human structure. But upon closer detailing, there are structures alongside this seeming road. It does exist. It is a city. And there are other such places, and they found tools at some of them. They found human remains at some of them. It depends on which one. There's one famous one, Yokoguma, I think it's called, up in Japan, where there's this huge, huge submerged, seemingly human-cut chunk of stone. There are slabs and little passageways and everything, little altars and stuff. Again, Mainstream archaeology has declared it either a hoax of some sort, which doesn't seem sensible, or they've said it's a naturally occurring structure. It doesn't appear to be a naturally occurring structure. It seems too even, too many right angles and too many corners for it to have not been carved by human hands. I think they stretch the imagination a little when they talk about seeing a face on it that looks like the Easter Island statues. I don't see a face there. It just looks like damage to me. Is it man-made? Possibly, yes. On that one, you have to remain more agnostic because they haven't recovered any sort of tools at the site. But they have in India. They have in the Caribbean. These are locations. There are sunken cities in the Mediterranean. There's supposedly a city underneath Lake Titicaca in Peru and Bolivia. How did these things get there is the main question. How was it deliberately flooded? No, these areas were on low-lying coastal regions. Then the Ice Age started to end and the water level rose. They simply got abandoned over time. And the reason behind proclaiming that this is strange is that, again, mainstream archaeology and history tells us humans really weren't that sophisticated until about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. About 8,000 years ago, things start to pick up a little steam, but it really wasn't until Sumeria and Egypt that people had, any sense. We've already got Göbekli Tepe. We've already got that showing that there were some sort of civilizations living in the Middle Eastern region long before Egypt, long before the Sumerians. So we know that. The further stretch of the imagination is to envision these sunken cities that are off the coasts of various land masses all over the world that have massive stone structures, and they're clearly man-made. These aren't like the one in Japan that appears to be possibly a natural formation. These are obviously worked. There are tool marks on some of these stones. There are plenty of right angles. They have the outlines of the houses. We know that they were at some time inhabited by man. But they can't possibly be from before 20,000 years ago. So that forces the evolution of human history back 10,000 years. And mainstream archaeology has to be dragged kicking and screaming into this. I've studied archaeology, and I've noted something among a lot of these people. They don't like to go against convention. But at the same time they do. And this was pointed out to me. There's a strange phenomenon in archaeology. There are a few people who desperately want to find something new that overturns all-going paradigms. There are people like that. They want incredible fame and fortune, number one, but they want to be renowned, so they come up with these various theories, and sometimes they get chastised because they'll come up with a theory, assume that it's true, and then go forth and test it with the bias that it's true to begin with, sort of in biblical character, like the Christians do, like the Zealots. And then there's everyone else that sort of just want to study things using systems that are already available. You can sort of make the differentiation between these two groups, and it's already been explained. There are people on both sides of this sort of artificially made aisle. The problem being most people belong to the latter group. You've got this consensus. The idea, and this didn't always used to be the way it was in archaeology. It used to be anybody with a shovel could go out and go dig in the ruins in some third world country and start making theories. It's not that way anymore. Today archaeology is much more academically structured and it's based on consensus. It's sort of like Wikipedia. I hate fucking Wikipedia because I've tried to make perfectly coherent edits before, and then they call in, well, the consensus dogs come in and say, well, let's build consensus, and they always go against me because what I put on there tends to deviate from the mainstream. And it doesn't leave any room for exceptional theories to be proposed, and the problem is, if the consensus is that your theory sucks, even if it's logically consistent, you can't get funding. Because a lot of the people that fund archaeological digs work for universities, maybe even competing universities, private businesses that rely on other archaeologists as well that may be pissed off that they funded you. Various governments that may disagree with the conclusions drawn by an individual archaeologist. This is the problem. It's not some conspiracy, it's just the way archaeology works. It's funded by a lot of private businesses and organizations that have bias inherent in their systems. And the same holds true for many sciences. It's all profit-making anyway, and it all deals with the sort of politically correct, you've got to respect the natives movements, even though sometimes these archaeological sites, if they were properly excavated, could bring millions of dollars into the local economy, but nobody really cares about that as long as they don't damage anything that the natives didn't know was there to begin with, lying under centuries of dirt. Speaking as someone who has Native American blood, one of the things the Native Americans in this country have done that fucks themselves in the ass is, specifically here in New England, we've got all of these burial chambers laying out in the woods, these stone chambers that really shouldn't be there because the Native Americans supposedly weren't building with stone very much at that time period, with all these astronomical lineups and significances to them. And they won't let them excavate the sites. And some of them are on private property anyway, but the ones held on native land, they won't let them touch them because they're sacred sites. Well, the archaeologists bend over backwards to feed into this belief, and at the same time they're saying natives weren't building these things. But it's still a native site, so we're not going to excavate it. We're not going to piss anybody off. Too bad if a 10,000-pound chunk of gold sarcophagus is lying underneath one of them after 2 feet of dirt, they won't even test the sites. This is the problem in modern archaeology, that there's almost too much respect for indigenous people that never really were being screwed over in the first place because some of these places got rich. Look at the Egyptian pyramids. What would have happened if they'd said, whoa, we can't go into the Valley of the Kings, we can't go in and do anything with the Great Pyramid? Where would the tourist attraction be? The area would be walled off and only for, Egyptians to look at. There wouldn't be those tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year being pumped into their economy. So I think people get screwed. But that's totally tangential, and I got off track there. The idea is this, that for various reasons, and the Smithsonian's been implicated with cock-blocking scientific research that doesn't bode well for the mainstream view of the world as well, that for various reasons mainstream archaeology and history simply haven't caught up with the evidence that we've unearthed in the last roughly 20 years. You've got to understand, we're in an archaeological renaissance right now. Göbekli Tepe is the most important find since the pyramids, potentially speaking. And some of these sites that are in various depths of water could be extremely important sites, but they have to get funding to actually excavate them. And again, you've got the problem with the local government wants a cut, some business that funds you wants, well, we want some artifacts, well, the government won't let us. Well, then you're not getting any funding. And these sites, if we go by the timeline of the Ice Age, the timeline of water rising and falling and glaciers coming and going, that's given to us by fairly valid geological science and oceanographic science. These sites can't be less than 20,000 years old. But that's impossible according to mainstream archaeology, because supposedly that long ago there were no agriculturalists. Nobody was using agriculture yet. Nobody was building with stone for the most part. Yeah, they might have made a little circle in stone for their campfire, but that's about it. These people supposedly were living in mud huts, essentially, using only the most rudimentary wooden and possibly stone tools without really understanding language or writing or anything like that. And of course, the other problem being a lot of organic remains. And I think this is something that's been overlooked, and I'll point something else out. One thing that's been overlooked, organic remains often decay. So we wouldn't be able to tell if some of these very old cultures may have been using paper, or may have been using wooden wagons, or there could have been many, many houses that were in these submerged areas that were made with wooden post-construction, but there's no way to tell because all remnants of it would have washed away. Here's where Caribbean archaeology, almost as a course that I took, comes in handy. The Caribbean largely was populated by people who built rudimentary wooden structures, and most of the remnants of their culture are clay, wooden post holes. You see, you put a wooden post in the ground, it stains the sand around it. You don't have the post left, you just have a stain. So you can map those stains by digging off the top layers and basically mapping out where they are. You can tell the rough outline of a building. And what are called middens, which are large piles of shells and bones, junk piles essentially. And you may see clay or charcoal or human remains scattered around, but they weren't building with materials that would stand the test of time. Largely, they were not using stone, they were using wood, because and some of these islands are essentially all sand, there's no stone to quarry. And I think we forget, in areas that do have stone construction, that there are other structures that are capable of being built. Here's another thing. It's like the idea of cave people that was finally debunked. The going trend until about the 90s was that most prehistoric human beings lived in caves, that they weren't capable of building any other such structures. They simply lurked around in the caves, painting with feces on the wall and butchering animals by clubbing them over the head. The reason that this myth was so widely accepted is because caves are great places to preserve artifacts. Whereas if a cave person dies in a little wooden hut village 15,000 years ago, you're not going to find any remains of that village. The spear has rotted away. You might find the bone of the caveman if it hasn't been scattered or crushed. You may find a spear tip, but you're not going to find remnants of their shelter or the wooden shaft of the spear or their clothes because they've rotted away. But in a cave, they're perfectly preserved. There's a bias inherent in any archaeological dig towards whether organic remains were capable of being preserved for the period of time from when that area was abandoned or last used in some way to the present era. If it's somewhere out in the desert where there's not much rain and the weather is fairly constant and there's not a lot of freezing cold and there isn't mold everywhere, then yes, organic remains tend to be well preserved. If it's in salt water, they happen to be generally well preserved. If it's in a cave, it's well preserved. If you're talking about somewhere else where there's a lot of rain and wild temperature changes, things tend to get broken apart within a matter of a few decades. You really don't have much left. And again, with the Bok Saga, if there was a prehistoric culture in Scandinavia that persisted before this last ice age, back during the last warm period, it would have been completely destroyed. There wouldn't be any remnants of it. There wouldn't be so much as a coin, because it all would have gotten ground up underneath these advancing glaciers, which were capable of moving entire mountains out of their way. So you wouldn't see any remnants of a civilization there. But again, with these ancient histories, you have to assume that there is at least some kernel of validity to it. We're not exactly sure what that is, but again, as with the Vedic tales, they said, this is the city of Wakatakatutu, and it disappeared, and it was on the shoreline, and by the way, our culture's been around for 50,000 years. And they search the whole land and they find nothing. They say, well, it must have been a myth. It's part of their native fancy. Of course, the records of the monks, those are considered perfectly legitimate, but anything outside of Europe, they were just crazed and on hallucinogens, which is a rather stupid way of looking at things when the Europeans were squatting in their shit huts while the people of India were still building massive temples. And then you look offshore and you find this city, and you have to wonder if these Vedic tales about there being cities that long ago are actually true. Stone cities, with ports, with sewer systems, with sinks, with showers. where people they're amassing grain storage, they're using agriculture. It's possible. It's not, people will say it's a conspiracy theory, they'll say it can't be true. Why? Because it doesn't coincide with the historical timeline is usually their reason. Well, neither does the existence of Göbekli Tepe, but it's there. It's 12,000 years old. It shouldn't be there according to these timelines. It shouldn't exist. People should not have created something that large and impressive during that time period. Yet it's there. The same holds true with these cities that are, perhaps miles offshore in some cases, in 100 feet of water. You have to assume that either these many dozens or hundreds of cities underwent one of two things. They were either submerged as the water level rose, as the Ice Age slowly ended, or else you can assume that by magical chance, these dozens or hundreds of individual locations scattered around the world all disappeared because, sinkholes swallowed them up or something. The ground below them shifted downwards rather than the water level rising. That seems rather unlikely compared to the former idea that the water level actually rose. And if even one of these locations that submerged didn't have that happen, where the land fell out from under it for some unexplained reason, the history of mankind as a civilized being goes back at least 20,000 years, not 10,000 years as even Göbekli Tepe would suggest, 20,000. So again, what's the next stretch? That maybe there were people that were civilized before the last ice age. Of course, in some cases, if something was that old, it would be buried under so much sediment by now, it would resemble a hill or something like that. And they've excavated these mounds, of course. Those aren't nearly as old. Could it be that before the last ice age there were in fact cultures in coastal areas that existed? It's possible. We know that humankind in a civilized manner is older and persisted longer than the archaeological record of the mainstream suggests. We know this for a fact now. There are plenty of people who will deny it. Usually they will point to people that bring the idea up. And they'll say, well, you're not trained in archaeology, so you wouldn't know. I am trained in archaeology. I'm not a PhD or anything like that, but I've had as much archaeological training as some of the people of the past had before they went out onto the beaches with a shovel and started digging for buried treasure. They formed the basis on what all modern archaeologists are doing. Other than the fact that now they've got all sorts of machines to test genetics and, forensic analysis and things like that. They obviously didn't have them back in the early 1900s to the same degree. But some of those individuals didn't even study archaeology. They just simply had a weird interest in it and started excavating. They read some book about how to do-it-yourself excavate a mummy, and they went out and did it. And they wrote books on it. Books that are still used to this day. So the lay people are not precluded from understanding archaeology just because they don't happen to have a degree in differential Caribbean skull analysis or something like that. The idea, it really is false logic. It really is an illogical statement to say that somebody is academically trained and therefore more intelligent and has better theories. Never been the case in any discipline. Not a single one. Yes, it helps you with the ability to learn and the ability to understand the methods used, but it really can't infuse you with that sort of spark of reasoning that allows you to look at what you're seeing and derive a conclusion from it, to see something others might not notice. It might take researchers 100 years looking at one site just to notice one little artifact wedged in the corner behind a secret compartment that opens up a whole new mystery. What I'm saying is that it seems that human life, civilized human life, is older than anybody in mainstream archaeology wishes to proclaim. That it was more advanced in a much earlier date. That a lot of the written records, again, with the Sumerians, I pointed that out in the last video, now the Vedic records, the Norse records. They talk about their civilizations being tens of thousands of years old, and nobody believed them. Until now, because now they realize there are ruins that go back beyond 10,000 years, which was a slap in the face to everything that people were taught when they studied world history or ancient history in high school. They were told, oh yeah, humans have only been civilized for a few thousand years, we're pretty new. Now we realize that's not the case. The time frame has been continually pushed back. It used to be that people said, well, the first real civilization was the Greeks back in the 1800s, and they kind of skipped over Egypt. They said, yeah, there's the pyramids, but you know, they were kind of advanced, but they were kind of ape-like anyway. Then it was Egypt. Then it was Samaria. Now it's some unknown group of people in Turkey. The next step being possibly Vedic and Scandinavian individuals were already building megaliths 20,000 years ago. It's something interesting that people need to look more into, and remember, you could be sitting on top of a megalithic ruin and not even know it. That got flooded over by sediment 10,000 years ago. It could be right under your feet. Out in the woods somewhere, out in the desert, you could find some cave that's got, you know, a mummy from 15,000 years ago sitting in it that nobody noticed before. They're still out there. Göbekli Tepe was buried under a hill of dirt and only got noticed because some farmer saw one rock sticking out of the dirt and said, that looks kind of odd, and started digging. Some, you know, crazed Turkish hermit was wandering around his field half drunk and probably sat on it and went right up his ass, and he said, oh, that feels unnatural, I better start digging. And you can look in Egypt, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the apocryphal texts that they found in Egypt. A lot of these things were buried, and they weren't found until fairly recently. And I think that archaeological and historical models are going to change wildly, and I think we're just barely on the cusp of discovering some of the weirdest things that you've ever heard about. I think all of our historical knowledge largely is going to go out the window in the next decade or so, because there are more and more people interested in it, more and more people searching, and a surprising number of fairly new amateur archaeologists. It sort of died off for a while. It was had its heyday back in the early 1900s. It's coming back now. As people study more about it, mainly because they see ancient aliens or something like that, and they're like, wow, I better go dig in my backyard. It's coming back. And the difference is, of course, if an archaeological team finds something really interesting, all of a sudden the government and some university swoops in to take away all the remains and bury it and then magically lose them. If you're just out in the woods and you find some mummy or something that's out of place, you could analyze it yourself. That's about all. Peace out.